To the great relief or disappointment of America's liberal commentariat, #the resistance, Donald Trump turns out to be neither a Russian stooge nor a communist stooge. He is, every bit as much as Hillary Clinton was, a military hawk, itching to start a war somewhere. And having already ramped up the drone and bombing campaigns in Iraq, Syria, Yemen and Somalia, he's also been escalating the rhetoric against North Korea. The irony of this is that, so American newspapers gloatingly told us, Trump was the preferred candidate of foreign dictators, whereas Hillary was their only determined nemesis. Did they get it wrong? In The Axis of Evil, famously coined in a Bush speech written by neoconservative intellectual David Frum, North Korea was one of the major bad guys. As the historian Bruce Cummings writes in a recent edition of the London Review of Books, the story of the North Korean state begins with the resistance against Japanese imperialism, beginning with the invasion of China in 1932. While future leader Kim Il-sung was fighting in that struggle, the United States was busy competing with the USSR for post-war dominance in the peninsula. And so, their war planners agreed to divide the peninsula. They chose the 30th parallel, and 3 weeks later 25,000 American combat troops entered southern Korea to establish a military government. There emerged two regimes, a southern anti-communist dictatorship and a northern regime led by Kim Il-sung and aligned to the USSR. But neither would respect the division imposed by the United States, and after several incursions of the north by southern forces and amid civil war in the south, North Korea's army crossed the 38th parallel. The US went to war to defend the state which its military had created, in a campaign that killed over 2.5 million civilians, and from that point onward has held the South in something of a protectorate arrangement, a relationship which South Korea has been increasingly unhappy about. The regular saber-rattling against North Korea helps to justify ongoing US presence, including 23,000 troops in the peninsula. The official rap sheet against North Korea in 2002 centered on its alleged proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. As Foreign Policy in Focus reported at the time, however, the Bush administration's escalation was based on allegations of chemical weapons manufacturing that were unsubstantiated by any new evidence. The policy, it said, looked like an attempt to justify America's expansive military plans in the region rather than actually reducing the threat from North Korea. All this bombast had little effect, and the Bush administration, a lame duck in its later years, reverted to diplomatic means to achieve the traditional US objective of pressuring the North to denuclearize. Late Bush-era rapprochement was succeeded by Obama's approach dubbed strategic patience, meaning apply brutal sanctions to the country and wait it out. Under the Trump administration, we are given to believe by Vice President Mike Pence, the era of strategic patience is over. Ironically, the threat of North Korea and its nuclear weapons system was given as one major reason by liberal pundits not to elect Trump president. Trump was positioned as a potential North Korea dupe or patsy. In June last year, Reuters gloated that North Korea has backed presumptive US Republican nominee Donald Trump with a propaganda website praising him as a prescient presidential candidate. Newsweek labelled the question, "Why does Kim Jong-un want Trump to be president?" To which it offered the answer that Trump was also the preferred candidate of the political elites in communist China, and pointed out that Trump, in an interview with the Washington Post, had been strongly skeptical of the US policy of having bases in South Korea. But those bases, media reports let us know, were absolutely essential. The North Korean threat was bigger and badder than ever. In September last year, the New York Times warned that North Korea was making headway in developing missiles that could hurl nuclear warheads halfway around the globe, threatening Washington and New York City. And it could have those skills as early as 2020. Of course, buried deeper in the article was an admission that ruined the effect of the whole piece. Still, experts note that North Korea is years away from deploying a reliable long-range missile. This is rather inconvenient for a lot of the scaremongering. In May, for example, Associated Press produced an article which pondered over a terrifying scenario. North Korea launches a preemptive nuclear strike on an American military base in Japan. For real. Would the US recoil and retreat? Would it strike back and risk losing Washington, D.C. in a second wave of nuclear attacks? Quite why North Korea would risk an attack on Japan, let alone a US military base, is never made clear. Nor is it explained that, in fact, North Korea is very unlikely to have the ability to engage in nuclear attacks on Washington, D.C. Instead, we're told it may become a real-world possibility on President Donald Trump's watch. So early on, the US media was concerned that Trump would harm the US empire's long-established interests in the peninsula, a concern conveyed in the form of hyperbolic fear-mongering. Trump, for his part, seemed rather chipper and relaxed about North Korea in the early days of his administration. Hearing news of a coming nuclear test back in January, he tweeted, "North Korea just stated it is in the final stages of developing a nuclear weapon capable of reaching parts of the US. It won't happen." In fact, as the New York Times reported, the announcement from North Korea had been that it was about to engage in a nuclear missile test, which it did. But a significant shift began to appear in the administration's rhetoric in April. This followed the ousting of General Michael Flynn from his position at the Pentagon and Trump's advisor Steve Bannon from the National Security Council. With missile strikes on a Syrian airfield, ostensibly in response to regime chemical weapons attacks, the Trump administration signaled that it could no longer be derided as Putin's patsy. It was reported in The Guardian, with a degree of eyebrow-raising, that Chinese state news claimed that the strikes were designed to intimidate North Korea. Vice President Mike Pence, Reuters reports, said that Trump's resolve had been shown in Syria and scolded the regime not to test the US. And so began an interesting shift in the news coverage of the Trump administration's foreign policy, particularly as it concerned the handling of North Korea. The Economist, never particularly sympathetic to Trump, scolded him for his bellicosity rather than his apparent timidity in the face of Pyongyang, but suggested that he had proved to be more cautious than his bluster makes him sound. Bloomberg News also noted the Trump administration's lack of nuance. Trump sees no middle ground, it reported, quoting Ambassador Nikki Haley, "You either support North Korea or you support us," without drawing the obvious parallel to Bush's War on Terror era rhetoric. But despite the bullish rhetoric, Trump was actually taking the traditional American tack of leaning on China to lean on North Korea. As ever with the Twitter president, Trump signaled his policy stance to North Korea's missile test via a tweet. "North Korea has shown great disrespect for their neighbor China by shooting off yet another ballistic missile, but China is trying hard." Some were concerned that he may be being a little soft on the Chinese. It wasn't just Fox News who warily inquired whether China was really trying hard enough to stop Pyongyang threat. It was a relieved Newsweek that reported that Trump had suggested China could do more, and had even been joined in that pressure by the Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. But not before Trump had an extraordinary phone call with the thuggish ruler of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, in which he managed to disclose the location of US nuclear submarines. "We never talk about subs," Pentagon officials complained to BuzzFeed. By late April, The Guardian reported, Trump was warning that the US could have a major conflict with North Korea. And as Agence France-Presse reported, he sent a naval fleet, an armada, very powerful, Trump insisted, toward North Korea. Obviously, Fox News was very impressed by this, and Britain's sewer rat Sun newspaper gloried in this display of military bravado. "Don's Armada hits town," it exulted. But this hadn't gone down well in South Korea, which Time said had alarmed South Korean politicians who warned against any unilateral action targeting Pyongyang. South Korean President Moon Jae-in said that South Korea should be the owner of North Korean issues and take the lead in dealing with them rather than letting countries such as the US and China manage them. Foreign Policy magazine reported that South Korea was more worried about Trump than Kim Jong-un. The tension only increased when it turned out that, as The Independent reported, 4 more launches for the controversial US THAAD anti-missile system had been brought into the country without President Moon being informed. That word controversial is used in many news reports without much explanation. The THAAD system is a global network of anti-missile systems developed at Pentagon expense by Lockheed Martin over several decades. Under a previous South Korean presidency, ousted amid corruption scandals in January, the government had agreed to go along with installing US launchers in the country. But President Moon had campaigned on an agenda of restoring cooperation with North Korea and had planned to review the system. The attempt to bypass an elected president on an issue central to his mandate is what is controversial in this context. Moon now says he wants to resolve the issue without Trump. What could resolve the issue? Graham Allison of Harvard warned in a New York Times op-ed that what we see unfolding now is a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. The US, by refusing to acknowledge any claims on the side of North Korea, was creating an untenable nuclear standoff. The only way out of this mess, he suggested, was that the US would have to consider drawing down its military presence in the peninsula in exchange for denuclearization. America would have to give up its interest in the South. And on that, Trump and his supposed critics in the establishment media are actually unanimous. They'd rather have another Cuban Missile Crisis.